Καλησπέρα και καλώς ήρθατε σε άλλη μια λέξη εκφραστικής ανάγνωσης εν μέσω κορονοϊού 2020. Σήμερα θα διαβάσουμε ένα ακαδημαϊκό κείμενο πάνω στο φαινόμενο της μουσικής του Igor Stravinsky. Είναι από μια σειρά διαλέξεων που είχε κάνει στο Harvard και είναι σε αγγλική μετάφραση, γιατί ούτε τα γαλλικά μου ούτε τα ρωσικά μου είναι σε επίπεδο τέτοιο που να μπορούν να σας μεταδώσουν το πρωτότυπο στη γλώσσα του μαέστρου. Poetics of Music in the Form of 6 Lessons by Igor Stravinsky. 2. The Phenomenon of Music. I shall take the most banal example, that of the pleasure we experience in hearing the murmur of the breeze in the trees, the rippling of a brook, the song of a bird. All this pleases us, diverts us, delights us. We may even say, what lovely music! Naturally, we are speaking only in terms of comparison, but then, comparison is not reason. These natural sounds suggest music to us, but are not yet themselves music. If we take pleasure in these sounds by imagining that on being exposed to them we become musicians and even momentarily creative musicians, we must admit that we are fooling ourselves. They are promises of music. It takes a human being to keep them. A human being who is sensitive to nature's many voices, of course, but who in addition feels the need of putting them in order and who is gifted for that task with a very special aptitude. In his hands, all that I have considered as not being music will become music. From this I conclude that tonal elements become music only by virtue of their being organized, and that such organization presupposes a conscious human act. Thus I take cognizance of the existence of elemental natural sounds, the raw materials of music, which, pleasing in themselves, may caress the ear and give us a pleasure that may be quite complete. But, over and beyond this passive enjoyment, we shall discover music, music that will make us participate actively in the working of a mind that orders, gives life, and creates. For at the root of all creation one discovers an appetite that is not an appetite for the fruits of the earth, so that to the gifts of nature are added the benefits of artifice. Such is the general significance of art. For it is not art that rains down upon us in the song of a bird, but the simplest modulation correctly executed is already art, without any possible doubt. Art in the true sense is a way of fashioning works according to certain methods acquired either by apprenticeship or by inventiveness. And methods are the straight and predetermined channels that ensure the rightness of our operation. There is a historical perspective that, like every view of things which is subordinated to the laws of optical perspective, only renders distinct those objects on the nearest planes. As the planes recede from us, they elude our grasp and only let us catch glimpses of objects devoid of life and useful meaning. 1,000 obstacles separate us from the ancestral riches which yield to us only aspects of their dead reality. And even then we grasp them by intuition rather than by conscious knowing. Hence, in order to lay hold of the phenomenon of music at its origins, there is no need to study primitive rituals, modes of incantation, or to penetrate the secrets of ancient magic. To have recourse to history in this case, even to prehistory, is that not to overshoot our mark by seeking to grasp what cannot be grasped? How shall we reasonably explain what no one has ever witnessed? If we take reason alone as a guide in this field, it will lead us straight to falsehoods, since it will no longer be enlightened by instinct. Instinct is infallible. If it leads us astray, it is no longer instinct. At all events, a living illusion is more valuable in such matters than a dead reality. One day the Comédie Française was rehearsing a medieval play in which the celebrated actor Monet Sali, according to the author's directions, had to swear an oath on an old Bible. For rehearsals, the old Bible had been replaced by a telephone directory. The script calls for an old Bible, roared Monet Sali. Get me an old Bible. Jules Claretie, the director of the comedy, promptly rushed into his library to find a copy of the Two Testaments in a magnificent old edition and brought it triumphantly to the actor. "Here you are, mon cher doyen," said Claretie, "a 15th century edition." "15th century?" said Mounet-Sully. "But then at that time it was brand new." Mounet-Sully was right, if you insist, but he attributed too much importance to archaeology. The past slips from our grasp. It leaves us only scattered things. The bond that united them eludes us. Our imagination usually fills in the void by making use of preconceived theories. In this way, for example, a materialist appeals to Darwin's theories in placing the monkey before man in the evolution of animal species. Archaeology, then, does not supply us with certitudes, but rather with vague hypotheses. And in the shade of these hypotheses, some artists are content to dream, considering them less as scientific facts than as sources of inspiration. This is just as true of music as of the plastic arts. Painters of every period, including our own, let their fancies roam through time and space and offer sacrifices successively, or even simultaneously, on the altars of archaism and exoticism. Such a tendency in itself calls neither for praise nor censure. Let us merely note that these imaginary voyages supply us with nothing that is exact and do not make us better acquainted with music. In our first lesson, we were astonished to find that, in the case of Gounod, 69 years ago even Faust at first encountered listeners who rebelled against the charm of its melody and were insensitive and deaf to its originality. What then shall we say about ancient music, and how could we judge it with the instrument of our reasoning mind alone? For here instinct fails us. We lack an indispensable element of investigation, namely, the sensation of the music itself. My own experience has long convinced me that any historical fact, recent or distant, may well be utilized as a stimulus to set the creative faculty in motion, but never as an aid for clearing up difficulties. One builds solidly only on the bedrock of the immediate, because what is no longer in use can no longer serve us directly. So it is futile to go back beyond a certain point to data that no longer permit us to contemplate the music itself. In fact, we must not forget that music of the kind that has meaning for us today is the youngest of all the arts, although its origins may be as old as man's. When we go back beyond the 14th century, material difficulties stop us short and pile up to such an extent that we are reduced to making conjectures when we come to decipher it. For myself, I cannot begin to take an interest in the phenomenon of music except insofar as it emanates from the integral man. I mean from a man armed with the resources of his senses, his psychological faculties, and his intellectual equipment. Only the integral man is capable of the effort of higher speculation that must now occupy our attention. For the phenomenon of music is nothing other than a phenomenon of speculation. There is nothing in this expression that should frighten you. It simply presupposes that the basis of musical creation is a preliminary feeling out, a will moving first in an abstract realm with the object of giving shape to something concrete. The elements at which this speculation necessarily aims are those of sound and time. Music is inconceivable apart from those two elements. To facilitate our exposition, we shall first speak about time. The plastic arts are presented to us in space. We receive an overall impression before we discover details little by little and at our leisure. But music is based on temporal succession and requires alertness of memory. Consequently, music is a chronologic art, as painting is a spatial art. Music presupposes before all else a certain organization in time, a chrononomy, if you will permit me to use a neologism. The laws that regulate the movement of sounds require the presence of a measurable and constant value, meter, a purely material element through which rhythm, a purely formal element, is realized. In other words, meter answers the question of how many equal parts the musical unit which we call a measure is to be divided into, and rhythm answers the question of how these equal parts will be grouped within a given measure. A measure in 4 beats, for example, may be composed of 2 groups of 2 beats, or in 3 groups, 1 beat, 2 beats, and 1 beat, and so on. Thus we see that meter, since it offers in itself only elements of symmetry and is inevitably made up of even quantities, is necessarily utilized by rhythm, whose function it is to establish order in the movement by dividing up the quantities furnished in the measure. Who of us, on hearing jazz music, has not felt an amusing sensation approaching giddiness when a dancer or a solo musician, trying persistently to stress irregular accents, cannot succeed in turning our ear away from the regular pulsation of the meter drummed out by the percussion? How do we react to an impression of this sort? What strikes us most in this conflict of rhythm and meter? It is the obsession with regularity. The asynchronous beats are in this case merely a means of throwing the rhythmic invention of the soloist into relief. It is this that brings about surprise and produces the unexpected. On reflection, we realize that without the real or implied presence of the beats, we could not make out the meaning of this invention. Here we are enjoying a relationship. This example seems to me to clarify sufficiently the connections between meter and rhythm in the hierarchical sense as well as in the chrononomic sense. What are we to say, now that we are fully informed, when someone talks, as is too often the case, about a fast rhythm? How can such a blunder be made by a reasonable person? For, after all, speeding up only alters movement. If I sing the American national anthem twice as fast as usual, I modify its tempo. In no way do I change its rhythm, since the relationship of note values remains intact. I have made it a point to spend a few minutes on this very elementary question, because one sees it strangely distorted by ignorant persons who singularly abuse the vocabulary of music. More complex and really fundamental is the specific problem of musical time, of the chronos of music. This problem has recently been made the object of a particularly interesting study by Mr. Pierre Suvchinsky, a Russian philosopher friend of mine. His thinking is so closely akin to mine that I can do no better than to summarize his thesis here. Musical creation appears to him an innate complex of intuitions and possibilities based primarily upon an exclusively musical experiencing of time, chronos, of which the musical work merely gives us the functional realization. Everyone knows that time passes at a rate which varies according to the inner dispositions of the subject and to the events that come to affect his consciousness. Expectation, boredom, anguish, pleasure and pain, contemplation, all of these thus come to appear as different categories in the midst of which our life unfolds, and each of these determines a special psychological process, a particular tempo. These variations in psychological time are perceptible only as they are related to the primary sensation, whether conscious or unconscious, of real time, ontological time. What gives the concept of musical time its special stamp is that this concept is born and develops as well outside of the categories of psychological times as it does simultaneously with them. All music, whether it submits to the normal flow of time or whether it disassociates itself therefrom, establishes a particular relationship, a sort of counterpoint between the passing of time, the music's own duration, and the material and technical means through which the music is made manifest. Mr. Suvchinsky thus presents us with two kinds of music. One which evolves parallel to the process of ontological time, embracing and penetrating it, inducing in the mind of the listener a feeling of euphoria and, so to speak, of dynamic calm. The other kind runs ahead of, or counter to, this process. It is not self-contained in each momentary tonal unit. It dislocates the centers of attraction and gravity and sets itself up in the unstable. And this fact makes it particularly adaptable to the translation of the composer's emotive impulses. All music, in which the will to expression is dominant, belongs to the second type. This problem of time in the art of music is of capital importance. I have thought it wise to dwell on the problem because the considerations that it involves may help us to understand the different creative types which will concern us in our fourth lesson. Music that is based on ontological time is generally dominated by the principle of similarity. The music that adheres to psychological time likes to proceed by contrast. To these two principles, which dominate the creative process, correspond the fundamental concepts of variety and unity. All the arts have recourse to this principle. The methods of polychromatics and monochromatics in the plastic arts correspond respectively to variety and unity. For myself, I have always considered that in general it is more satisfactory to proceed by similarity rather than by contrast. Music thus gains strength in the measure that it does not succumb to the seductions of variety. What it loses in questionable riches, it gains in true solidity. Contrast produces an immediate effect. Similarity satisfies us only in the long run. Contrast is an element of variety, but it divides our attention. Similarity is born of a striving for unity. The need to seek variety is perfectly legitimate, but we should not forget that the one precedes the many. Moreover, the coexistence of both is constantly necessary, and all the problems of art, like all possible problems for that matter, including the problem of knowledge and of being, revolve ineluctably about this question, with Parmenides on one side denying the possibility of the many, and Heraclitus on the other denying the existence of the one. Mere common sense, as well as supreme wisdom, invite us to affirm both the one and the other. All the same, the best attitude for a composer in this case will be the attitude of a man who is conscious of the hierarchy of values and who must make a choice. Variety is valid only as a means of attaining similarity. Variety surrounds me on every hand, so I need not fear that I shall be lacking in it, since I am constantly confronted by it. Contrast is everywhere. One has only to take note of it. Similarity is hidden. It must be sought out, and it is found only after the most exhaustive efforts. When variety tempts me, I am uneasy about the facile solutions it offers me. Similarity, on the other hand, poses more difficult problems, but also offers results that are more solid and hence more valuable to me. Needless to say, we have not exhausted this eternal subject here, and we shall want to return to it. We are not in a conservatory, and I have no intention of bothering you with musical pedagogy. It is not my concern at this point to bring up certain elementary principles which are known to most of you, and which, if need be, supposing that you may have forgotten them, you would find clearly set forth in any textbook. I shall not detain you with the concepts of intervals, chords, modes, harmony, modulation, register, and timbre, none of which are at all ambiguous, but I shall dwell for a moment on certain elements of musical terminology that may lead to confusion, and I shall try to clear up certain misunderstandings, as I have just done in regard to the chronos by speaking about meter and rhythm. All of you know that the range of audible sounds constitutes the physical basis of the art of music. You also know that the scale is formed by means of the tones of a harmonic series arranged in diatonic order in a succession different from the one that nature offers us. You likewise know that the pitch relationship between two tones is called an interval, and that a chord is the sound complex that results from the simultaneous sounding of at least three tones of a different pitch. All is well up to this point, and all this is clear to us. But the concepts of consonance and dissonance have given rise to tendentious interpretations that should definitely be set aright. Consonance, says the dictionary, is the combination of several tones into an harmonic unit. Dissonance results from the deranging of this harmony by the addition of tones foreign to it. One must admit that all this is not clear. Ever since it appeared in our vocabulary, the word dissonance has carried with it a certain odour of sinfulness. Let us light our lantern. In textbook language, dissonance is an element of transition, a complex or interval of tones which is not complete in itself and which must be resolved to the ear's satisfaction into a perfect consonance. But just as the eye completes the lines of a drawing which the painter has longingly left incomplete, just so the ear may be called upon to complete a chord and cooperate in its resolution, which has not actually been realized in the work. Dissonance, in this instance, plays the part of an allusion. Either case applies to a style where the use of dissonance demands the necessity of a resolution. But nothing forces us to be looking constantly for satisfaction that resides only in repose. And for over a century, music has provided repeated examples of a style in which dissonance has emancipated itself. It is no longer tied down to its former function. Having become an entity in itself, it frequently happens that dissonance neither prepares nor anticipates anything. Dissonance is thus no more an agent of disorder than consonance is a guarantee of security. The music of yesterday and of today unhesitatingly unites parallel dissonant chords that thereby lose their functional value, and our ear quite naturally accepts their juxtaposition. Of course, the instruction Pardon. Of course, the instruction and education of the public have not kept pace with the evolution of technique. The use of dissonance, for ears ill prepared to accept it, has not failed to confuse their reaction, bringing about a state of debility in which the dissonant is no longer distinguished from the consonant. We thus no longer find ourselves in the framework of classic tonality in the scholastic sense of the word. It is not we who have created this state of affairs, and it is not our fault if we find ourselves confronted with a new logic of music that would have appeared unthinkable to the masters of the past. And this new logic has opened our eyes to riches whose existence we never suspected. Having reached this point, it is no less indispensable to obey not new idols, but the eternal necessity of affirming the axis of our music, and to recognize the existence of certain poles of attraction. Diatonic tonality is only one means of orienting music towards these poles. The function of tonality is completely subordinated to the force of attraction of the pole of sonority. All music is nothing more than a succession of impulses that converge towards a definite point of repose. That is as true of Gregorian chant as it is of a Bach fugue, as true of Brahms's music as it is of Debussy's. This general law of attraction is satisfied in only a limited way by the traditional diatonic system, for that system possesses no absolute value. There are few present-day musicians who are not aware of this state of affairs. But the fact remains that it is still impossible to lay down the rules that govern this new technique. Nor is this at all surprising. Harmony, as it is taught today in the schools, dictates rules that were not fixed until long after the publication of the works upon which they were based, rules which were unknown to the composers of these works. In this manner, our harmonic treatises take as their point of departure Mozart and Haydn, neither of whom ever heard of harmonic treatises. So our chief concern is not so much what is known as tonality as what one might term the polar attraction of sound, of an interval, or even of a complex of tones. The sounding tone constitutes in a way the essential axis of music. Musical form would be unimaginable in the absence of elements of attraction which make up every musical organism and which are bound up with its psychology. The articulations of musical discourse betray a hidden correlation between the tempo and the interplay of tones. All music being nothing but a succession of impulses and repose, it is easy to see that the drawing together and separation of poles of attraction, in a way, determine the respiration of music. In view of the fact that our poles of attraction are no longer within the closed system which was the diatonic system, we can bring the poles together without being compelled to conform to the exigencies of tonality. For we no longer believe in the absolute value of the major-minor system based on the entity which musicologists call the C scale. The tuning of an instrument, of a piano for example, requires that the entire musical range available to the instrument should be ordered according to chromatic steps. Such tuning prompts us to observe that all these sounds converge towards a center which is the A above middle C. Composing, for me, is putting into an order a certain number of these sounds according to certain interval relationships. This activity leads to a search for the center upon which the series of sounds involved in my undertaking should converge. Thus, if a center is given, I shall have to find a combination that converges upon it. If, on the other hand, an as yet unoriented combination has been found, I shall have to determine the center towards which it should lead. The discovery of this center suggests to me the solution of my problem. It is thus that I satisfy my very marked taste for such a kind of musical topography. The superannuated system of classic tonality, which has served as the basis for musical constructions of compelling interest, has had the authority of law among musicians for only a short period of time, a period much shorter than is usually imagined, extending only from the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 19th. From the moment when chords no longer serve to fulfill merely the functions assigned to them by the interplay of tones, but instead throw off all constraints to become new entities free of all ties, from that moment on one may say that the process is completed. The diatonic system has lived out its life cycle. The work of the Renaissance polyphonists had not yet entered into the system, and we have seen that the music of our time abides by it no longer. A parallel progression of ninth chords would suffice as proof. It was here that the gates opened upon what has been labelled with the abusive term atonality. The expression is fashionable, but that doesn't mean that it is very clear, and I should like to know just what those persons who use the term mean by it. The negating prefix a indicates a state of indifference in regard to the term, negating without entirely renouncing it. Understood in this way, the word atonality hardly corresponds to what those who use it have in mind. If it were said that my music is atonal, that would be tantamount to saying that I had become deaf to tonality. Now, it well may be that I remain for a considerable time within the bounds of the strict order of tonality, even though I may quite consciously break up this order for the purposes of establishing a new one. In that case, I am not atonal, but antitonal. I am not trying to argue pointlessly over words. It is essential to know what we deny and what we affirm. Modality, tonality, polarity are merely provisional means that are passing by and will even pass by. What survives every change of system is melody. The masters of the Middle Ages and of the Renaissance were no less concerned over melody than were Bach and Mozart. But my musical topography does not reserve a place for melody alone. It reserves for melody the same position that devolved upon it under the modal and diatonic systems. We know that the term melody, in the scientific meaning of the word, is applied to the top voice in polyphony, thus differentiating melody from the unaccompanied cantilena that is called monody. Melody, melodia in Greek, is the intonation of the melos, which signifies a fragment, a part of a phrase. It is these parts that strike the ear in such a way as to mark certain accentuations. Melody is thus the musical singing of a cadenced phrase. I use the word cadenced in its general sense, not in the special musical sense. The capacity for melody is a gift. This means that it is not within our power to develop it by study, but at least we can regulate its evolution by perspicacious self-criticism. The example of Beethoven would suffice to convince us that, of all the elements of music, melody is the most accessible to the ear and the least capable of acquisition. Here we have one of the greatest creators of music, who spent his whole life imploring the aid of this gift which he lacked, so that this admirable deaf man developed his extraordinary faculties in direct proportion to the resistance offered him by the one he lacked, just the way a blind man in his eternal night develops the sharpness of his auditive sense. The Germans, as we all know, honour their 4 great Bs. On a more modest plane we shall select 2 Bs for the needs of our argument. At the time when Beethoven bequeathed to the world riches partly attributable to the recalcitrance of the melodic gift, another composer, whose achievements were never equal to those of the master of Bonn, scattered to the winds with indefatigable profusion magnificent melodies of the rarest quality, distributing them as gratuitously as he had received them, without even being aware of the merit of having created them. Beethoven amassed a patrimony for music that seems to be solely the result of obstinate labour. Bellini inherited melody without having even so much as asked for it, as if heaven had said to him, "I shall give you the one thing Beethoven lacks." Under the influence of the learned intellectualism that held sway among music lovers of the serious sort, it was for a time fashionable to disdain melody. I am beginning to think, in full agreement with the general public, that melody must keep its place at the summit of the hierarchy of elements that make up music. Melody is the most essential of these elements, not because it is more immediately perceptible, but because it is the dominant voice of the symphony, not only in the specific sense, but also figuratively speaking. But that is no reason for allowing ourselves to be beclouded by melody to the point of losing balance and of forgetting that the art of music speaks to us in many voices at once. Let me once again call your attention to Beethoven, whose greatness derives from a stubborn battle with rebellious melody. If melody were all of music, what could we prize in the various forces that make up the immense work of Beethoven, in which melody is assuredly the least? If it is easy to define melody, it is much less easy to distinguish the characteristics that make a melody beautiful. The appraisal of a value is itself subject to appraisal. The only standard we possess in these matters depends on a fineness of culture that presupposes the perfection of taste. Nothing here is absolute except the relative. A system of tonal or polar centers is given to us solely for the purpose of achieving a certain order, that is to say more definitively, form, the form in which the creative effort culminates. Of all musical forms, the one considered the richest from the point of view of development is the symphony. We usually designate by that name a composition in several movements, of which one confers upon the whole work its symphonic quality, namely the symphonic allegro, generally placed at the opening of the work and intended to justify its name by fulfilling the requirements of a certain musical dialectic. The essential part of this dialectic resides in the central portion, the development. It is precisely this symphonic allegro, which is also termed the sonata allegro, that determines the form upon which, as we know, all instrumental music is constructed. From the sonata for a solo instrument through the various chamber ensembles, trios, quartets, and so on, all the way to the most extensive compositions for huge orchestral masses. But I do not wish to bother you further with a course in morphology that does not correspond exactly to the object of my lessons, and I only mention the subject in passing to remind you that there exists in music, just as in all the other arts, a sort of hierarchy of forms. It is customary to distinguish instrumental forms from vocal forms. The instrumental element enjoys an autonomy that the vocal element does not enjoy, since the latter is bound to words. Through the course of history, each of these media has left its impress upon the forms to which it has given rise. Basically, such distinctions constitute only artificial categories. Form is born of the tonal medium, but each medium so readily borrows forms that were developed by other media that the mingling of styles is constant and makes discrimination impossible. Great centers of culture, such as the Church, have in the past welcomed and cultivated vocal art. In our time, choral societies can no longer fulfill the same task. Reduced to upholding and presenting the works of the past, they cannot lay claim to playing the same role, because the evolution of vocal polyphony has been arrested for a long time. Song, more and more bound to words, has finally become a sort of filler, thereby evidencing its decadence. From the moment song assumes as its calling the expression of the meaning of discourse, it leaves the realm of music and has nothing more in common with it. Nothing shows more clearly the power of Wagner and of the kind of storm and stress which he unleashed than this decadence which his work actually consecrated and that has developed apace ever since his time. How wonderful this man must have been to have destroyed an essentially musical form with such energy that 50 years after his death we are still staggering under the rubbish and racket of the music drama, for the prestige of the synthesis of the arts is still alive. Is that what is called progress? Perhaps, unless composers find the strength to shake off this heavy legacy by obeying Verdi's admirable injunction, let us return to old times, and that will be progress. Καλό βράδυ.